5 years ago, I took a permaculture design course that focused on regenerative practices on larger acreage. At some point, someone asked if it was possible to replicate the systems we were learning about on just a few acres. To my surprise, the general consensus was no. To be fair, the broader context of the conversation was factoring in the ecological impact along with what made sense from a business and time point of view. Well, not only do we think we're giving it a pretty good shot, but our small homestead is able to provide our family with 100% grass-fed beef and dairy all year without a crazy amount of time and cost. We'll break down how we rotationally graze our cows on pasture and show how simple it can be to raise these gentle creatures on a small scale. As you can see, our systems here are very basic. I think one of the big misconceptions about getting a milk cow is that you need a fancy setup with fancy equipment. When we purchased Thimble, our family milk cow, the previous owners gave us a basic halter and a milk pail, and that's all we had. We made a makeshift water trough out of a cooler strapped to a T-post, and we were doing it. Pretty quickly, we invested in a few more things. A second milk pail with a lid, which we'd highly recommend especially for rainy days, some actual water troughs, and things like a weighted rubber feed bowl that we use for giving our cows minerals. But still, our upfront cost was low, and our setup is anything but fancy. Instead of a stanchion, we tie her off to one of our flimsy fence posts, and it's worked great. We do have a barn stall she can go in the winter, or if weather is really bad, but for the most part, we are out here doing our thing every morning. When it comes to keeping any type of animal, fencing is going to be one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle to figure out. We'll break down more of our fencing setup later, but we were so thankful that day one moving onto our land, we were able to track down some electronetting fence, a solar fence energizer, and set up paddocks for our cows on what was at the time an abandoned hayfield. This hayfield sat fallow for probably a decade or more and was in sad shape. Because it wasn't being managed, the undergrowth just continued to build up and so much of the plant life was squelched out. That was 4 years ago, and every year since then, as we've rotationally grazed our cows through this field, we've seen this field continue to explode back to life and thrive, along with our cows within this system. What we mean when we say rotational grazing is moving your animals in a system across your pasture land instead of just letting them loose across all of it. We do this by creating a series of fenced paddocks. Our cows spend one day in each paddock, and then they move into the next one over with fresh pasture. So they're basically making continuous loops around our whole pasture throughout the growing season. This offers many benefits, both for the land and for the cows. After a section is grazed down, it's always given at least 30 days to regrow, causing deeper and stronger root structures for your pasture plants, so they'll hold up better over time to hoof traffic and drought. The cows also return to a section of pasture when it's at its peak, offering them a lot of nutritional diversity of proteins, vitamins, and minerals. Cows raised in this system are generally healthier and less prone to disease and other conditions. And when managed well, it truly is a regenerative system where the pasture is providing for the needs of the cows, and the cows are giving back what's needed to the pasture and soil in the form of manure. There are reasons, however, why rotational grazing isn't all that common. Mainly the time and energy requirements it takes to make it happen. To have the next paddock ready for the cows every day means I'm out there every day taking down fencing and setting it up again. But on the flip side, we've seen what can happen when animals are left in a larger fenced area that's unmanaged, which is the more common alternative to rotational grazing. Over time, it gets overgrazed, and eventually both the health of the land and the animals on it takes a hit. We see rotational grazing as a way to invest in the health of our land and animals for the long haul, which ultimately comes back to the health of our family in the foods we eat. Now don't get us wrong, this system isn't perfect and we didn't just come out and nail it day one. We're probably on our third or fourth system for how we set up our fencing and rotate our cows through it. But we've seen tremendous improvement and efficiency with each new system, and we've come a long way since I was out there with only a weed whacker trimming down paths for our fencing. One of the advantages we've loved about keeping cows is how well they respect the fencing. Even though it can seem that smaller acreage is better suited for smaller animals like sheep or goats, they can also be more challenging to keep contained within your fencing. We've started dividing our paddocks with just 2 strands of fencing, and there's been very few issues of the cows getting past it. And we've hardly had any issues at all with the cows messing with the electro-netting fence that we have along the perimeter, and we've been using that for several years now. Another question we get asked often is, what about having young kids with electric fencing? It really hasn't been an issue. Our 8, 6, and even our 3-year-old know how to turn the fence on and off and are excited to do so when we go out to the pasture area and do chores. There really aren't times when our little ones are out there by themselves and would be at risk of being shocked. And I've been shocked many times on accident out there doing chores. Joelle's been shocked. Even our kids have gotten shocked a time or two, and it's really not that bad. The degree of the shock is somewhat relative to your size, so a cow is going to feel it a lot more than people, and little people are going to feel it less so even. So it's just like touching a hot pan. You move on quickly from it and you learn your lesson. Back in the house that day, one of the things on my list was to butter a fresh wheel of farmhouse cheddar cheese I had made a couple days prior. The butter is also a fresh batch that Joelle made in the past week. It's so cool how we not only have milk readily available for fresh drinking, but dairy really does make up a significant part of our diet. We supply 100% of our own butter, yogurt, sour cream, cheese, and even things like ice cream and other yummy treats. And when it comes to beef, our freezer is always stocked. High quality steaks, roast, ground, and super nutritious organ meats are no longer things we have to limit to stay within our budget. Like today, we're just cooking up some steak to have for lunch, and that's a pretty regular occurrence in our world. Before we bought our homestead, I was working at a farm that rotationally grazed sheep using electro-netting fencing from Premier One. They were longtime supporters of Premier One's fencing and many of their other products, and I've been a fan ever since too. It's a family-run operation out of Iowa, and they make high-quality, durable products and have excellent customer support. And this is not an ad for Premier One, by the way. We just genuinely like their products. The first thing you want to do when setting up electro-netting is mow down a path for where you'll be installing it. This is because any tall grass or plants touching up against the netting will short out or weaken the current running through there. I've found this is where it's really helpful to have a mower that can handle tall, thick grass. We just got our tractor this year, but before that I was using a way underpowered riding mower, and it was a really frustrating experience. Pasture grass can get tall and dense, so having something that's up for the challenge is a must. While electro-netting is still pretty affordable compared to other fencing options, it is an upfront investment. But as I mentioned earlier, it can also get you up and going with animals right away if you don't have any permanent infrastructure in place yet, or if you're still trying to figure out your layout long term. We were thankful to have found our electronetting used on Facebook Marketplace from a high schooler that was raising sheep for 4-H for a few years and sold it off in really great shape once she moved on. There are many different configurations this fencing comes in. Different heights and lengths, different sized posts. Some you step in like the type we have. Others have a single spike on the bottom and you stick them in the ground. I personally prefer the step-in posts because when things dry up and the ground gets really hard, those posts can get really tricky to stick in the ground. But the best thing to do is to check out the Premier One website or talk to their customer support to get the right setup for your needs. They do also have poultry netting with a tighter mesh pattern, which is great for chickens, or we even use this stuff around our garden areas to keep predators out. And since this is electric fencing, you'll need a fencer or fence energizer too. We have a couple of Premier One's older solar fencers that we also picked up used, but they have some much nicer and even more portable, newer models available now. Again, this is something you'll want to make sure you size correctly for your needs. The more sections of fencing you are using, the more powerful of an energizer you'll need to make sure it's being effective. We like the solar fencers because they're super easy and portable, but there are also plug-in options too. You'll need to come up with your own fencing configuration for your land and setup, but how ours works is that I divide up our back field into 3 separate rectangular sections that I fence off. Each ends up being about an acre. My fence sections are 164 feet long, which is the longest Premier One makes. I use 5 or 6 of those at a time to set up my perimeter fence. I've found it's helpful to have a couple extra sections of fencing on hand too. You might have noticed that the first thing I did before taking down their current fencing was used an extra section of fencing to make a temporary holding pen for our cows. Without some extra fencing, I'd never be able to keep everyone contained. To move fencing sections, you basically just gather up one post at a time and go on down the line. The netting itself just hangs between the posts you gather and kind of folds up like an accordion. Then to set up the section of fencing again, you start at your starting point and lay down one post at a time, stretching the fencing in between the posts. Then you head back to your starting point and step each fence post in one at a time. This whole process has gotten much easier over time. Early on, I'd get things tangled up all the time, or my fencing would be really loose. But you kind of just learn how to handle the fencing over time to avoid getting tangled up and to install nice straight and tight fence lines. Joining 2 sections of the fencing together is really simple. There are ropes on each end post of the fence sections, and you just tie the 2 end posts together. Then there's a clip at the top of each end post that you slide in and lock together. That clip is what transfers the electrical current from one fence section to the next. You can see after setting up 5 sections of fencing, I came up about 40 or 50 feet short. Again, this is where it's helpful to have some extra sections of fencing and also different lengths available. They also make 50 and 100 foot sections in addition to the longer sections like I have. And I do have one 50-foot section, but since I do have another full-length section that matches the height of this fencing, I'm going to just use that, and the extra length of fencing will just lap the fence section next to it a bit. Now we have our perimeter fence complete. So before moving Thimble in here for the night, I need to section off a paddock for her within the perimeter fencing. We do this with fiberglass posts, and I use 2 runs of braided polywire on the posts. We used to divide up our paddocks with more electronetting. However, this meant a lot of extra mowing, which was pretty tedious for dividing up paddocks. The beauty of the single strands on the posts is that they hang above the pasture grasses and plants, so they're not touching them and shorting out. And we've found that the 2 strands is pretty sufficient to keep a cow from trying to get through it. I had a friend pass off these fiberglass posts and the yellow plastic clips or insulators to me, but I picked up the polywire at Farm and Fleet, and these are all things that you can find at your local farm store. Premier One also has comparable items, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're higher quality and have a better design. I wouldn't say this is the official way to do this by any means. This was just me figuring out how to get something up and running with what I had. But what I do is start by putting my fiberglass posts in about every 10 to 15 feet or so. Then I take my coil of the polywire and tie the end of the strand onto the electronetting in 2 different spots. This will help make sure there's contact to transfer the current from the fence to the strand. Then I loop it around the top yellow standoff plastic piece and lock it into place. After that, you just walk it down to the other end of your fencing, installing the top strand along the way. Hopefully you can see how I'm running the line through those yellow insulator standoff pieces down at the other end. I've tried a lot of different ways of doing it, but this way is both simple and seems to really lock everything in place and provide some extra contact for the electrical current. Then you walk back to your starting point on the other side and install the bottom strand. At the end, I just loop it around the top post several times and then hang the remaining coil of wire on top of the post, and it all just kind of stays in place. One thing that I should mention is that I always start this coil on the back side of the fence. This makes the end post at the front side of the fence easier to remove for moving animals between paddocks. Altogether, moving those fiberglass posts and the braided strands takes 10 to 15 minutes each day. After the fencing is all in place, I'll make sure to get their water set up for them in the next paddock. We just run 4 or 5 100-foot hoses from our barn out to the back field here, and that's worked great for us. I also really like using the 40 or 44 gallon stock tanks for this setup. That size tank works with any size or species of animal you have, so they're great for both our cows and our livestock guardian dog Stella, and it gives us the option to add sheep or goats into the mix down the road if we wanted. And they're not heavy or huge and pretty easy to move around on a daily basis. And if you don't have a lot of trees in your pasture, one of the things we've discovered if you want some really happy cows is to give them a T-post in there to scratch their heads on. The last thing is getting your fencer all set up. Inside these cases is the electric fencer unit itself, along with the batteries, and then the solar panel sits on top and keeps it all charged. The batteries are what allows it to hold a charge and keep running through the night. Since our fencer is larger, we have 2 ground rods that I'll pound in. It's good to give a couple feet of space between them. Once those are in, you really just clip the red alligator clip on the fence clips, and then the black one goes on the ground rods, and then you turn on your fencer. It's worth picking up one of these fencing testers to make sure it's all doing its thing correctly. And while these solar energizers are great in that they're harnessing the power of the sun, they also need their batteries replaced every 2 or 3 years. Based on what I'm seeing here, since our fencer is struggling to reach the top output consistently, I'm thinking I'll need to replace our batteries at the end of the season. While there's such an abundance of life that happens on the farm, part of that cycle is also death. We've not looked forward to this day on our calendar for a while, but unfortunately today is the day we have scheduled to bring June into the butcher. It's definitely sad for all of us in a lot of ways, but we are so grateful for June's life and the nourishment she will provide for our family in the years ahead. A couple years ago, we found a really good deal on a used livestock trailer locally, and we went for it. It was in really good shape and just the right size for any of our purposes. You definitely do not need your own livestock trailer if you have cows or other animals. We've borrowed them before, and you can often rent them too. But now that we have one, it does come in handy on the homestead, and we've been able to lend it out to other families we know raising animals in the area. I do, however, borrow a truck from a friend when I pull the trailer. Our minivan can technically pull it, and we do that from time to time, like when we loaded it up with our meat chickens earlier this year and brought them to our processing day at another farm. But our processor for our cows is almost 2 hours away, and I feel much more comfortable with a truck that's more heavy duty for pulling a full-grown cow. Just because you raise cows and other animals doesn't mean you need to just go out and buy everything. Even trucks and trailers can be borrowed. We did not do a very good job of halter training June early on, so I attempted first to get her on the halter, and unfortunately I missed my first opportunity, and from trying this before, I knew continuing to attempt with the halter was just going to be a waste of time. This is a big part of why we moved the fencing the day before. We don't have any sort of handling system or equipment, so we just reconfigure the electronetting a bit and use a spare section to form sort of a makeshift chute leading to the trailer. Then we use the spare 50-foot section of fencing I mentioned earlier and walk behind her with that to gently guide her into the chute and toward the trailer. Unfortunately, I forgot that we really needed the full back door of the trailer open for her to feel comfortable enough to hop up in there, and not just the small chute door that I had opened. So attempt 1 ended with her busting out, but once we had that back door wide open, attempt 2 went much smoother and we were able to get her in relatively easily.
Watch out, she's not in.
Saying goodbye is definitely an emotional time for all of us. The next day, a new reality set in for us on the homestead. There was one less cow there to greet us as the sun rose and we headed out to milk and do chores. But it's a reality that we wouldn't trade for the world. Our cows are happy being raised in as natural and nourishing a system as possible. Our land is continually being replenished and sustaining the life around it, and we have a constant supply of the best meat and dairy we could hope for.